Welcome back. Now, if you remember from our last video, we discussed the physical and historical geographies of Australia and the Pacific. Now, this presentation will cover the economic and cultural and political geography of this region. So I'll start off by making this a little bit bigger so you can see it. Because Australia and New Zealand's economies are so much larger than the rest of Oceania, we'll start off by focusing on these two countries before we move to the Pacific Islands. Like many other developed countries, Australia saw a massive increase in GDP beginning in 2002 when it jumped from $395 billion in 2002 to $1.6 trillion in 2013. But like most countries, Australia's economy took a hit in 2014 due to the falling oil prices, a drop in Chinese markets, and rising interest rates in the United States, both of which are major trading partners with Australia. Now you can see this dip here towards the top of the graph. Now New Zealand saw a rise in economic output between 2000 and 2014, as you can see here, when its GDP jumped from $54 billion in 2001 to $201 billion in 2014. Similar problems occurred when GDP dropped to 177 billion in 2015. Of course, until COVID-19, both New Zealand and Australia had bounced back after the decline in 2015, so we're going to have to keep an eye out in the near future to see what kind of effect this virus has had on their economies. Now we can get a closer look at economic data from this link in the bottom to the World Bank website. See if my internet's going to work. There we go. All right, so notice that the population for both Australia in the blue here and New Zealand in the green here have steadily increased since 1960s. Now this has been spurred by increased immigration over recent decades and has been responsible for some of this economic growth that you see here in GDP. Unfortunately, population growth did not stall in 2014 like the economies in these countries, so this has had an adverse effect on many of the people in these two countries. Now, as you can see from the bottom here, GNI per capita, that individual incomes have taken a major hit since 2014 as Australia declined from 65,000 per person to 51,000 per person in 2017, and then New Zealand went from 41,000 in 2014 to 38,000 in 2017. Now, interestingly, school enrollment has declined in both countries since the 1980s. Now, this may be due in part to a declining fertility rate in both countries and the fact that most of the immigrants that are coming to these countries are above primary schooling age. Fortunately, as you can see from this graph right here, life expectancy has been steadily improving since the 1980s with this slight plateau that you see here in recent years. Now, this slide shows GDP and GNI per capita for the top producers in Oceania. Papua New Guinea is at the top of the list for GDP, but it is in the middle of the pack for GNI per capita, as you can see from the graph here on the right. Now, this is because Papua New Guinea's large population. More people generally equals a large GDP, but doesn't mean that these people are wealthy on an individual level. Now, fortunately for many of these island countries, GDP and GNI per capita has steadily increased between 2012 and 2014, like other countries across the globe. Increased supply chains and shipping in the Pacific between the United States, China, and Japan and Australia has spurred some of this growth. Many of these countries are needed as fueling points between deliveries. In addition, Papua New Guinea was one of the few countries on the list that was impacted by the economic downturn in 2015 when its GDP dropped from 23 billion in 2015 to a low of 21 billion in 2016. As you can see, this drop is pretty noticeable here on this graph to the left. Now, Fiji and Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and Samoa have been able to avoid major disaster because of their local economies. They are rather closed-off economies for the most part, other than the international shipping that goes through their ports, and so international affairs don't have as big of an impact on such a small population. Now, as you can see from the GNI per capita graph on the right, individual incomes across the region have grown dramatically in recent years, And countries like Fiji and Samoa have taken advantage of location and use international trade as a tool for economic development. Now, these two countries also depend on tourism as a major source of income. Now, we can look at some more information with this World Bank link down here. Now, notice the link between population and GDP growth in these countries. As population increased in Papua New Guinea, so did GDP at an incredible pace. However, the other countries have seen slow and steady growth with very little, if any, population growth. Now, population is highly dependent on resources, so most of these countries don't have high population growth rates because their resources couldn't support a large population. Now, this has resulted in slower GDP growth that is less dependent on population growth rates. Excuse me. Now, school enrollment has been highly volatile for many of these economies because population numbers remain fairly stable except for Papua New Guinea. And as you can see from here, this particular country saw a steady rise in primary school attendance, located here, followed by a crash in 1998. Low primary school attendance in Papua New Guinea is due to the large number of traditional societies that exist there. Now, fortunately for all the countries on this list, life expectancy rates have steadily increased over the past decades. Now, this has resulted in a large working age population, which has helped to improve economic output. Now, I'll make this slide a little bit smaller, and we'll cut back to Google Maps over here so we can get a view of the region that we're looking at. Now that you have an idea of the economic trends in this region, we will break up our discussion into two separate parts and focus on Australia and then move our discussion to Oceania. Now, Australia was originally settled as a penal colony, but it became apparent to the British that this massive piece of land contained major resources needed for industrialization. Now, these resources have helped build a manufacturing sector post-World War II, but this sector has recently been in decline. Now, as businesses have moved to places like Indonesia and Malaysia to the north, this has had a negative effect on manufacturing in this particular country. Recently, the Australian government has recognized its violent history and extended Aboriginal land rights. Unfortunately, much of the Aboriginal population in Australia have been marginalized, so recent movements have brought their culture to the forefront of society. One example is the Central Desert art movement started by the Papunya community in 1971. Now, because of Australia's location south of Eurasia, it receives immigrants from various regions in the Far East. Now, this has been precipitated by the end of the whites-only policy in the 1970s. Many of these immigrants have migrated to the booming urban centers on the continent. Now, the combination of increased immigration in the vast, inhospitable outback in Central Australia, 86% of their current population live in cities near or along the coast. Now, finally, increased immigration in Australia has led to the government passing what has been known as the Pacific Solution, which resulted in the shipping of thousands of asylum seekers to islands like Nauru. We will discuss these issues in more detail in just a few minutes. Now, as stated earlier, Australia is a massive territory with an abundance of resources. Interestingly, Australia has been able to avoid the resource curse. Now, this is partially due to its investment in manufacturing and other industries. However, it was also a close ally with Britain and the United States, so the same corporate mercantile policies used on countries in Africa were not applied to Australia. Now, as you can see from the map here on the left, most resources in Australia are located within 1 day's travel to the coast. Now, these are also major regions for agricultural production. The vast outback in the central of Australia, shown here in the blue, has a major impact on prices for agricultural goods. Now, the closer you get to the center of the outback, the more expensive the agricultural products are. This is largely due to shipping costs and refrigeration. Now, the top natural resources are iron ore, coal, oil, and natural gas. Australia is also the world's leading export in coal, iron ore, diamonds, rutile, zinc, and zirconium. even with declining sales of coal in recent years, Australia has been able to keep their primary sector intact with the exploitation of natural gas and offshore oil platforms. Now, manufacturing in Australia is also a major sector. However, it has been in decline since 2012 because many factories have moved to countries like Malaysia, Philippines, and Indonesia. Now, as you can see from the graph on the upper left here, manufacturing production boomed after 2004, but crashed in 2007 in the wake of the global financial crisis. Now it bounced back up, but took a dive in 2012 after car manufacturing stalled due to changes in consumer spending. The consumer market shifted from buying cars to using rideshare programs like Lyft and using bicycles instead of cars. Now this had a major impact on manufacturing. I'd like to put a caveat here though, that while this is the main line that's being pushed by economists around the world, and especially in Australia, there are many other variables to look at here. Also, problems with the financial policies of many Western countries has led to the increased decline in manufacturing, and ultimately open trade policies have allowed many of these transnational corporations to move out of Western countries like Australia and move to places with cheaper labor. Now, currently, the top manufacturing industries are food, beverage, and tobacco products, machinery and equipment, metal products, and chemicals, petroleum, and rubber. Now, as you can see from this table on the bottom left, food industries employed about 27% of manufacturing employees, machinery employed 20%, metal products employed 15%, and chemicals, petroleum, and rubber employed about 10.3%. Now, if we look at the geography of manufacturing employment, the largest percentage of workers are located in the southeastern part of Australia, where many of the largest cities are located, as you can see here on this map. Now, there are also clusters of manufacturing employment in proximity to Perth, located here in the southwest, and in coastal Queensland in the northeast, located here. Interestingly, roughly 15% of the population in Meekatharra, which is in this dark-colored territory here, it works in the manufacturing industry. Now, the table on the bottom right here shows manufacturing statistics for Australia. Notice that in 2018, only 2.7% of the population worked in manufacturing. This is a 5-year decline of 2.6% and a 10-year decline of 8%. Now, this decline is representative of many of the countries, especially developed countries across the globe. Now, as stated earlier, for more than a century, the Aborigines were considered wild animals by the government of Australia and had no formal rights. By the 1970s, a series of laws were passed extending rights to these individuals, especially land rights. Now, of course, this wasn't done out of the kindness of the government's heart. A series of protests by several prominent Aboriginal leaders eventually led to the creation of these land rights. Now, the map on the right here shows land rights and reserves in orange, exclusive possession native titles in blue, non-exclusive possession native titles in yellow, registered native title claims in gray, and non-indigenous owned or claimed conservation areas in this green. Notice that most of the land extended to the indigenous peoples are in inhospitable territories in the desert region. Several prominent leaders have complained that the Australian government is only extending these rights to these lands in particular because they don't have any formal use for resource extraction. Now, let's watch this short video clip titled Australia's Land Rights, the Mabo Decision and Native Titles.
Terra nullius is a Latin term meaning land belonging to no one, used as a justification to possess land in the European age of imperialism. It gave people rights to claim land that was seen as uninhabited and, in essence, meant finders keepers. When British Captain James Cook occupied Australia in 1770, this legal term was used to justify the denial of the natives' connection to the land. The land was taken and occupied as Crown land in the name of the King of Great Britain. It was no longer the Indigenous people's rights to use the land as they please. Under international law, the land was now British. For many years after that, there remained a debate. Whose land was Australia? Is Terra Nullius a justification for taking another's land? Why did James Cook and his British occupiers feel that they had the right to take the land? These questions sparked many protests and fights for land rights between Indigenous and non-Indigenous across the country. The real change in the fight for land rights came with the case of Eddie Mabo. 212 years after Cook possessed the land for British gain, Eddie Mabo realised the lack of rights that he as a native of Australia had over his own land on Murray Island. Murray Island was considered a part of the state of Queensland's Crown land, and Mabo and the Meereen people who had a connection to the land for thousands of years before actually had no rights to build on, farm or use the land freely. This made Mabo angry, and Eddie and 4 of his friends set out to fight for his people to be regarded as the legal owners of the land. He argued that Indigenous people had a true connection to this land and that Terra Nullius denied them of this. He struggled for 10 years to gain the right to his land. First, he filed a case against the state of Queensland, which he lost. He then, with the help of lawyers and others who believed he had a good case, went to the High Court of Australia and fought to nullify the principle of Terra Nullius altogether, arguing that Aboriginal people had a native title to their land. On 3rd of June 1992, the High Court judges upheld the claim and ruled that the lands of this continent were indeed not Terra Nullius. The new native title doctrine nullified Terra Nullius and corrected a wrong that was made many years before. In 1993, legislation for a Native Title Act was passed that recognised and protected some people's connection with the land, validating this pre-existing relationship. This has enabled many Indigenous families and groups to prove that the land is theirs, giving them chances to claim native title. The outworking of land rights in Australia has not been very easy and clear-cut since this Act. There has been hundreds of claims of native title and thousands of negotiated agreements between Indigenous peoples for land rights. Undoing a mistake like a land claim is not easy when so many different people now consider a place their home.
Now, the fight for Aboriginal land rights coincided with a growing cultural movement in the Central Desert region of Australia's Northern Territory. Beginning in 1971, the Papunya community in the Central Outback began an art movement using acrylic paint. The Central Desert Art Movement, as it became known, grew out of this Papunya's art form and emphasizes cultural cosmology. Elders simplified the art form to keep the, quote, uninitiated from understanding the significance. So just to get an idea of how important this is, let's take a minute to watch this short clip about this Central Desert Art Movement.
It was kicked off initially in Papunya, obviously, as the company's name suggests. Papunya was a settlement that was set up to accommodate a group of different language groups. The settlement, for a number of reasons, wasn't a great place, particularly for those people that were living away from their traditional lands, and that was, of course, the majority of the founders of this art movement. The art gave these men a great vehicle to express themselves and illustrate that they weren't happy where they were and that they belonged and wanted to be somewhere else. The painting movement itself started in the middle of 1971. The company itself was formed officially in November 72. There's no doubt now that it has an international brand. It's something that has global recognition. There's been shows in pretty much every continent, dating back to the 70s. It could have petered out long ago. It hasn't. It's gained strength and it's grown and grown. And 40 years is a long time for an art movement. It's probably never been done before. The people that own the company, people like Ronnie, are actually shareholders of this organisation. They've always had a huge amount of pride in the fact that they own something that's considered value to non-Indigenous people. Like, we appreciate the people out there because of this. Over the years, Papunya Chula Artists has been able to support the community on a number of different levels. So the proceeds and the profits made by the company are ploughed back into the community. Those areas involve health. We work quite closely with the clinic. We have programs going with the school. We're sponsoring kids who achieve highest attendance rates now are being rewarded with bikes, which is a good thing. I can't imagine what the community would be like if this organisation hadn't have been there from the start. If someone out there's short of money to sponsor or pay for or purchase whatever, it's over to the Arts Centre, which is great. The artists have got that ability, they've got the resource, and it gets used in their own community.
So Australia's economy and proximity to Southeast Asia has attracted immigrants and asylum seekers over the past several decades. Now, the growing number of immigrants followed the end of the white-only policy of the 1970s, where the Australian government limited immigrants to Western and Northern Europe, Canada, and the United States. Now, after Australia ended its white-only policy, thousands of people from countries like the Philippines, Vietnam, India, and China migrated to Australia for the promise of high-paying jobs. Now, this has resulted in a more multi-ethnic society. However, as you can see from the map on this slide here, the largest number of immigrants in 2014 came from the UK and New Zealand. Today, 67.4% of Australians come from British descent. 8.7% come from Ireland, 3.8% from Italy, 3.7% from Germany, 3.6% from China, and then only 3% are of Aboriginal descent, essentially being outpopulated. Now, because of the inhospitable environment in the interior of Australia, 86% of its population lives in cities along the eastern seaboard and southwest coast. Sydney is located on the east coast of Australia and is considered its largest city with 5.23 million people. Melbourne comes in a close second with 4.9 million people. Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, Gold Coast, Newcastle, and Canberra, which is the capital of Australia, are all located in the eastern Australia, while Perth is located down here and is the largest city along the west coast with roughly 2 million people. Now, the graph on the upper left gives you an idea of how these cities compare in population. Now, the map on this bottom left shows the distribution of population and shows the 5 top cities of Australia. This picture here on the top is the skyline of Sydney with the beautiful Sydney Opera House on the coast right here. This is a picture of Melbourne, and as you can see, the Prince's Bridge in the foreground. Now, the pictures below Sydney here is the skyline of Brisbane, and this picture over here is Perth, both major shipping and distribution hubs to Asia. Now, growing conflict in Asia led to an increase in asylum seekers in the late 90s and early 2000s. Now, in 2001, the government of Australia instituted the Pacific Solution to deal with increased undocumented asylum seekers. Now, this law mandated that undocumented asylum seekers be held in detention centers in Nauru and small islands near Papua New Guinea. Human rights activists around the world called for the Australian government to stop sending their asylum seekers to these prison camps on these islands. Now, the graph on the upper left here shows the number of people showing up on unauthorized boats between 1989 and 2013. Now, you'll notice the quick uptick in 1998. This was the reason for shipping the asylum seekers to Nauru and other small islands. Now, the Pacific Solution was ended in 2008, due to mass protests, and undocumented immigrants to Australia increased until it reached 2,587 people in 2013. Now, that same year, the Australian government passed bills collectively known as the P&C Solution and Operation Sovereign Borders, both of which placed naval units around the coast to stop new arrivals. Now, the number of people in immigrant detention programs followed a similar trajectory, as you can see from this graph here on the bottom left. Thousands of asylum seekers were placed in prison camps like the ones you see on the pictures to the right. Let's look at this news article from the London Guardian for more information. I'll make this a little bit bigger so you can see it. Titled Offshore Detention, Australia's Recent Immigration History as Human Rights Catastrophe. With a deal on the table that could mean the closure of the detention centers on Nauru and Manus, Helen Davidson reviews the saga of offshore processing. A deal with the U.S. to settle an unknown number of refugees from Australia's offshore processing centers could mark the end of one of Australia's most contentious political and moral issues over the past 15 years. Since offshore processing was restarted in 2001, it has grown into an internationally condemned secretive regime subject to hundreds of court cases in Australia and overseas. Inside the centers, there have been violent deaths, horrific acts of self-harm and abuse, and mass protests. The centers have emptied and swelled, peaking under the former Labor government. The government's line, hardened over the years by both Labor and the coalition, had left it in an immovable position. Not one asylum seeker who comes by boat can settle in Australia, lest its policy be seen as a failure. Australia's government claims its harsh policies have stopped the boats, despite some recent attempts, and thus the deaths at sea. It assumed any future arrivals would be dealt with as they are now, with enhanced screening processes and boat turnbacks. The Pacific Solution. Offshore processing restarted in earnest in 2001 after the Tampa affair, when a Norwegian freighter rescued 433 asylum seekers from their sinking vessel 140 kilometers from Christmas Island. Against international law, Australia refused the Tampa entry into its waters, sparking an international controversy. Dubbed the Pacific Solution under then Prime Minister John Howard, the policy saw all asylum seekers who arrived by boat intercepted at sea and sent straight to offshore camps established in Nauru and Papua New Guinea's Manus Island. Christmas Island, closer to Indonesia, was excised from the Australian migration zone to host another center. A subsequent Labor government would more than 10 years later excise the entire Australian mainland. Following the Children Overboard incident in 2001 and the death of 353 men, women, and children in the CF-10 disaster, asylum seekers were a major political issue, and Howard went to a federal election with his infamous declaration that, quote, "We will decide who comes to this country and the manner in which they come." Howard won the election and offshore processing continued. Concerns about indefinite detention and its impact on physical and mental health was widespread among advocates and rights groups. Now, the detention camps housed more than 1,500 people. Between 2001 and 2008, 705 people from the offshore centers were resettled in Australia and 401 in New Zealand. Some asylum seekers remained in detention for years, but the boat arrivals slowed. And in 2008, offshore processing was dismantled by the new Labor government led by Kevin Rudd. However, arrivals began again, and several high-profile tragedies, including an explosion on a boat near Ashmore Reef in 2009 and the crash of CF-221 on the coast of Christmas Island in 2010, contributed to a death toll at sea estimated at more than 1,000. This is quite a long article, so I'm not going to read all of this, but if you'd like to finish reading about this and get more information about this, it's a rather interesting political topic and unfortunate human rights catastrophe. This is from the London Guardian, titled Offshore Detention, Australia's Recent Immigration History, a Human Right Catastrophe. All right, so let's go back to the slide. So while Australia has been the major focus in this region, there are some interesting aspects to other countries in Oceania as well. The soils on volcanic islands make these landforms much more hospitable for larger populations because they can participate in large agricultural production. Atolls, on the other hand, have poor soil, which can limit the number of people that can be sustained for a long period of time. This is one reason why the populations of atolls follow irregular trends, increasing some years and decreasing in others. However, atolls are excellent sources of fish, as well as we will discuss in more detail in a few minutes. One of the major issues plaguing Oceania is the legacy of imperialism. Some of these islands were abundant in phosphorus, which is used as a fertilizer, and bird guano, which is used as a fertilizer and fuel source. In fact, if you want to read more information about the legacy of U.S. imperialism in these islands, there's an excellent book by Daniel Immerwahr titled How to Hide an Empire. While he is a professional historian, he does come at this at a historical geography perspective, which is quite interesting. Again, a thick book, but an easy read, and it really goes into the detail about how important some of these minor islands that are just an afterthought to us today, how important they were to the growing U.S. empire in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and the people that we revere the most as political leaders and as humanitarians were some of the worst culprits in the rise of the U.S. empire. Excellent book. Now, because of colonialism and colonial governments, many of these governments have been replaced by political leaders rife with corruption. One example is Fiji, which has seen a series of rigged elections and revolutions since the 1950s. Now, finally, while many of these countries have used up their resources and have been plagued by corruption, several prominent countries have benefited from sovereign wealth funds, which have helped these countries during economic downturns. Now, as stated in the previous presentation, coral atolls are formed when coral larvae attach to the raised ocean floor surrounding volcanic islands. Once the volcano collapses into a caldera, all that's left above the ocean surface is the raised coral. This produces coral atolls like the one pictured here in the bottom left. Coral atolls are made up of calciferous reef materials with poor agricultural soil. This makes it virtually impossible to grow large farms. Now, recently the U.S. military began a soil remediation program on Midway, which is, of course, a military base. So we can find that on this map so you can get a better look of it. Midway Atoll. There we go. All right, so Midway is not the quintessential atoll that you think of, but it is certainly calciferous coral reefs that have created this over time. So this program was designed to remove what's called cesium-137 from the soil because, according to recent data, this particular particulate hinders plant growth. Now, the U.S. military added potassium fertilizer to the soil in some areas, which had a positive effect, and they then dug up 30 to 40 centimeters in other areas to force the nutrients up from underneath the soil. Now, these experiments worked but are too expensive for smaller countries in the Pacific to institute. So many of these countries have depended solely on small farms and fisheries, as atolls are an excellent source of marine fish. Now, the picture on the upper right here is a fish market on the atolls, on one of the atolls in French Polynesia. So we can get a better idea. Let's take a look at French Polynesia over here on the map. Now, French Polynesia is, of course, a series of islands that are connected across a vast oceanic surface. The main French Polynesian island here is volcanic, of course, and then as you move further away, you start to run into Tetiaroa here, which is a coral atoll, and other coral atolls that are linked together one by one. Now, most of these islands don't support much of a population, but some of them, such as this particular atoll, have some beachfront property and have hotels and spas for visitors. Now, again, this is a fish market in one of the atolls of French Polynesia, and it shows you a large supply of parrotfish, which is an important resource for the local population. Now, volcanic islands have the benefit of fertile soil, so they can sustain a much larger population. For example, if we go back to the main island of French Polynesia, which is known as Papeete, and the island of Tahiti and the city of Papeete. This particular island is home to 189,000 people and has a major agricultural industry. Now, this picture in the upper middle of the page the bottom middle of the page is an avocado plantation in Tahiti, which gives you an idea of some of the production of agricultural products that goes on in this particular in this particular island. Now, other islands such as Makatei have an abundance of phosphorus and use the profits to enrich their population. Now, however, this has had a negative impact on some islands in the Pacific. For example, the exploitation of phosphorus in Nauru by the Germans in 1930s and 40s created a banana republic out of Nauru. When it gained its independence in 1986, mining intensified until most of the phosphate had been stripped and the island's economy went south. Now, in the process of mining phosphate to fertilize fields in faraway places, Nauru had rendered its own landscape infertile. Today, the island is a barren wasteland with jagged limestone pinnacles that cover about 80% of the island. Now, profits from the phosphorus made the small population of Nauru extremely wealthy, but once the resources disappeared, so did that wealth. Other countries, such as Tuvalu and Kiribati, were able to avoid total collapse by investing their domestic returns in sovereign wealth funds. Now, a sovereign wealth fund is a state-owned investment fund or entity which comprises of pools of money derived from a country's reserves. Now, reserves are funds set aside for investment to benefit the country's economy and its citizens. Now, the funding for a sovereign wealth fund comes from central bank reserves, which accumulate because of budget and trade surpluses, official foreign currency operations, money from privatization, government transfer payments, and revenue generated from exporting of natural resources. Now, as this slide says below here, the legacy of imperialism created power vacuums, and corrupt leaders arose to power in many of these Pacific Island countries. Many countries plundered their resources for personal wealth, only to eventually run out. Fortunately, many island countries were using sovereign wealth funds to benefit their citizens. Now, while some countries have benefited from sovereign wealth funds, Tonga, an unfortunate example of how poor investment can go wrong, the government of Tonga entrusted their entire wealth fund to an investor named Jesse Bogdanov, and he would eventually lose all of their savings. So let's read this article from Investment Migration Insider titled "The Bizarre Story of How the King of Tonga's Court Jester Lost $26 million Made from Passport Sales." This is the incredible tale of how a Hong Kong businessman persuaded the King of Tonga to sell $26 million worth of citizenship to Chinese investors, and how the King's Court jester lost it all by trading life insurance policies for the terminally ill. Citizenship by investment has not always been a legitimate business. In the 80s and 90s, a variety of Pacific Island nations sold thousands of citizenships by way of opaque methods unburdened by regulatory oversight. As far as we know, the first person to propose exchange of citizenships for capital in the Pacific was Hong Kong entrepreneur George Chen, who had become the honorary consul of Tonga in China. In 1982, he persuaded the king of Tonga, Tafuahu Tupou IV, who at the time was genuine monarch with ultimate control over the government, to authorize the sale of passports in Hong Kongers. The Pacific state began by issuing Tongan protected person passports, which conferred neither citizenship nor residence rights in the country, not even visa-free entry. Predictably, many countries questioned the authenticity of the passport and refused TPPP holders. The king realized that in order to make money, he had to sell actual passports. Sale of real Tongan citizenship commenced in earnest in 1983. Among the first customers were ousted Filipino dictator Ferdinand Marcos, his wife Imelda of shoe collection fame, and their children. Throughout the 80s and 90s, the king, with the help of George Chin, sold in excess of 7,000 passports, raising some U.S. $26 million. Now, the U.S.-born Jesse Bogdanoff had multifaceted career history. A Buddhist who had earned his MBA in night school, his CV included stints as a carpenter, dishwasher, musician, and trail guide, as well as a salesman of magnets that purportedly cured back pain. He would later take up work as a professional hypnotist. So this guy was a real snake oil salesman. By the mid-90s, however, Bogdanoff worked as a security salesman at the San Francisco branch of Bank of America. One day he noticed that an ordinary checking account with an enormous balance had been left to languish for years, earning only a modest rate of interest. The money was the Tonga Trust Fund. Bogdanoff recognized an opportunity. In 1994, according to the LA Times, Bogdanoff traveled to Tonga. On his third day there, a mutual acquaintance introduced him to the king, and the two reportedly hit it off immediately. For the next 5 years, still working for Bank of America, Bogdanoff would manage the Tongan account from Tonga. He claims he helped the country earn nearly $10 million by moving some of the money out of the low rent-bearing checking account and into higher return asset classes like bonds. But in 1999, disillusioned by a heavy workload and internal changes at Bank of America, Bogdanoff decided to leave the company. There was only one problem. He could not take the Tonga account with him without leaving himself open to a lawsuit from his previous employer. The only possible solution to the conundrum would be to somehow become an employee of the kingdom. And that's exactly what Bogdanoff did. He convinced the king to appoint him court jester. Bogdanoff himself explained it this way. I thought, I'm born in April Fool's Day, and I have never been able to capitalize on that. I ought to become the king's jester. I am a natural-born fool, he said, according to a CNN article. The royal decree to Bogdanoff jester reads, "With my royal blessing may he go forth, king of jesters and jester to the king, to fulfill his royal duty, sharing mirthful wisdom and joy as a special goodwill ambassador to the world." Like any court jester's worth his salt, Bogdanoff regaled the king with flattering poetry and melodies played on a grand piano. That same year, the court jester received a promotion. The king appointed Bogdanoff financial advisor for the Tonga Trust Fund, a service for which he would receive a flat fee of $250,000 a year. In an article from 2002, the Chicago Tribune explains what happened next. According to the 27-page lawsuit against Bogdanoff and others, the Tonga Trust Fund followed Bogdanoff's advice, putting the bulk of its money into what they were told were perfect no-risk investments that failed, and investing in companies the government later learned were paying Bogdanoff secret and exorbitant commissions for bringing in investors. The fund invested $500,000 in FilmAccess.com, an international electronics film distribution company that ultimately filed for bankruptcy, and $4 million went to the Trinity Flywheel Power, a startup company developing power storage systems and alternative energy devices that the lawsuit contends is struggling to continue its existence and has stopped making owed payments to the trust. The vast majority of the money, $20 million, went to Millennium Asset Management Services, a company that purchased viaticals, the benefits of life insurance policies of people who were insured and believed to have little time left. The Tonga Trust was to receive $26 million for its Millennium investment in less than 2 years, due on June 6, 2001. The money, the equivalent of more than half of the government's annual revenues, has never appeared. Now, there's more to this story. If you'd like to read this yourself, you can take a look at it. There are plenty of Plenty of news stories about this, but this is the most complete one that I could find from Investment Migration Insiders, titled "The Bizarre Story of How the King of Tonga's Court Jester Lost $26 million Made from Passport Sales." Interesting stuff. It's amazing what can happen when you don't really know what you're doing as a leader of a government. So before we end this presentation, I'd like to focus on one particular fascinating island chain called Pitcairn Islands. As the slide says, there are 4 separate islands in Pitcairn Island Group located in the South Pacific, about 1 degree south of the Tropic of Cancer. Because of prevailing warm currents from Peru, Pitcairn stays warm all year, and rains are irregular depending on currents. Now, these islands are overseas territories of the United Kingdom, with about 50 permanent residents that live in Adamstown in the Pitcairn Island. As you can see from the climate graph here on the right, temperatures remain fairly steady throughout the year, ranging from about 20 degrees Celsius in the winter to 25.5 degrees during the summer. Rainfall is irregular throughout the year and highly dependent on the Pacific Oscillation, so long-term droughts are common throughout geological history. Now, this has also played a major role on the island's inhabitants and their ability to survive. Now, the map on the left here shows Pitcairn's Economic Exclusive Zone, or EEZ. Now, an EEZ is an area which is beyond and is adjacent to a given country's territorial sea that extends no more than 200 nautical miles from the coastline. Now, the areas which are under the EEZ of a country gives them full rights to explore and exploit the marine resources in its adjacent continental shelf. Now, it is important to note that Pitcairn's EEZ, only because this is where it gets most of its resources. Oino and Ducie Islands are too small to support a continuous population, and Henderson Island is made of uplifted coral, so its soil are inhospitable to modern farming techniques. So these islands are used as docking points for fisheries. Now, this map shows the ocean currents around the world. As you can see, the Pitcairn Islands, located here in the purple, sits right on top of a warm current from northern Peru. Unfortunately, if any minor oscillation in the ocean currents occur, this can have devastating effects on the Pitcairn population. And this map here shows each one of the Pitcairn Islands. Oino, located here, and Ducie, located here, are small coral atolls and have really good fisheries, but there's no archaeological evidence that these islands ever sustained permanent populations. Now, like I said before, Henderson Island here is a raised coral island and cannot support major agricultural production. However, it is the largest of these 4 islands, and recent archaeological evidence has revealed that it may have been home to a few thousand Polynesian residents prior to the arrival of the British. Now, today, Henderson Island is uninhabited, but home to thousands of pieces of trash, as you can see from this picture right here. Compost is attracted off of the coast of northern Peru and other countries in South America as it cycles around and then eventually lands on Henderson Island. To get a better idea of just where these islands are located, let's go to Google Earth, and we can find ourselves in the middle of the South Pacific. So here are the 4 Pitcairn Islands, and you can see these islands are considered to be some of the most, these islands are considered the furthest away from any other continents as are any other oceans in the South Pacific, and so they're relatively isolated compared to other Polynesian islands. Now, this, where it says Pitcairn Islands, this is actually Henderson Island, and you can see the size of this island is about 1.5 miles to 2 miles across its width and about 4 miles in length. However, if we go to the island of Pitcairn, you can see it's much smaller. And from one side of Adamstown to the other side, you have about roughly 3,000 feet and roughly about 1.5 miles long. Now, Pitcairn here is the second largest island of the group and contains the total population of these islands in this single small town of Adamstown. Now, as this slide says, Pitcairn Island is located more than 3,000 miles from the nearest continent, making it one of the most remote islands in the world. Now, the fact that it was settled by Polynesians at all is absolutely amazing to me. Now, it was probably colonized between 800 and 900 AD and lasted 4 centuries before it disappeared. Polynesians settled on Pitcairn Island, which is a volcanic island, and Henderson Island, which is made of coral and limestone, building a large fishing and stone building civilization that traded with Mangareva for other goods. Now, the map on the left here is an artist's rendition of the main Pitcairn Island, which is the only volcanic island of these 4 islands. Therefore, its soil is the most fertile for crop production. Now, the picture here in the upper right is a collection of stone tools found by local residents. These tools were used by early Polynesians for building houses and, of course, small farms. Now, this picture here is a pictograph carving by early Polynesian settlers, which would imply that they may have created some early form of handwriting, which goes against earlier claims by archaeologists that there was no formal writing form in the Polynesian culture. Now, archaeological evidence suggests that Pitcairn and Henderson Islands were the last stop on the supply chain of the early Polynesian civilization. Tree ring data points to a major long-term drought between 1000 and 1200 AD in the Pacific that may have led to the destruction of the Polynesian supply chain network. Other islands such as Mangareva and Tahiti, which were major trading partners for Pitcairn and Easter Island, and located at the center of this supply chain, were able to avoid total collapse, although they did have enormous drop in population numbers at the time. But of course, Rapa Nui, as discussed in the last presentation, and Pitcairn in this presentation, really felt the brunt of this drought. Now, some scholars have speculated that the Polynesian population of Pitcairn resorted to cannibalism because teeth marks have shown up on bones found during archaeological digs. Now, by the time the British arrived, these islands were deserted. In 1767, the empty island of Pitcairn was spotted by Captain Philip Carteret, who named it after his son Robert Pitcairn. In 1789, a British ship called the HMS Bounty, led by Captain William Bligh, was seized by Lieutenant Fletcher Christian and a number of crew members in a mutiny. Bligh was sent off on a light boat and made it back to England. The mutiny landed on Pitcairn but was unable to sail again. Now, the crew and several Tahitian women were all that remained. Now, according to historians, the HMS Bounty left England in 1787 on a mission to collect and transport breadfruit plants from Tahiti to the West Indies. A 5-month layover in Tahiti, during which many of these men lived ashore and formed relationships with native Polynesians, led many men to be less amenable to military discipline. Relations between Bligh and his crew deteriorated after he began handing out increasingly harsh punishment, criticisms, and abuse, Christian being a particular target. Now, after 3 weeks back at sea, Fletcher Christian and others forced Bligh from the ship, which you can see an artist's rendition of this in the upper right-hand corner. 25 men remained on board afterwards, including loyalists held against their will and others for whom there was no room in the launch, which is this boat shown here in this painting. Now, after Bligh reached England in April 1790, the Admiralty dispatched HMS Pandora to apprehend the mutineers. 14 were captured in Tahiti and imprisoned on board Pandora, which then searched without success for Christian's party that had hidden on Pitcairn Island. Now, after turning back towards England, Pandora ran aground on the Great Barrier Reef with the loss of 31 crew and 4 prisoners from the Bounty. Now, the 10 surviving detainees reached England in June 1792 and were court-martialed. 4 were acquitted, 3 were pardoned, and 3 were hanged. Christian's group remained undiscovered on Pitcairn until 1808, by which time only one mutineer, John Adams, remained alive, which the town Adamstown was named after. Almost all of his fellow mutineers, including Christian, had been killed either by each other or by Polynesian companions. No action were taken against Adams, as it was determined that he had already served his punishment. Descendants of the mutineers and their Tahitian captives would live on Pitcairn until the 21st century. Now today, Pitcairn has the smallest number of residents of any autonomous territory in the world. The island is an overseas territory of Queen Elizabeth, with a governor in England, commissioner in New Zealand, and a mayor in Adamstown. There is also a unicameral legislature made up of 10 people. In 2004, the island was hit by controversy when 7 of the 12 men on the island went on trial in British courts for the sexual assault of women aged between 13 and 24 years old. Now, let's read this article from CBS News titled "Sex Trial on Pitcairn Island" for some more information. See if it'll load up. All right. A series of sexual abuse trials opened on Pitcairn Island, the isolated British territory in the Pacific that is home to descendants of the 18th century HMS Bounty mutineers. The first alleged victim said she was raped as a young girl by the island's mayor. The unprecedented trial of 7 men, more than half the island's adult population, on 55 charges began Wednesday in the island's community hall, which has been converted into a court staffed by judges and lawyers from New Zealand, but operating under British law. Some of the island's 47 permanent residents accused Britain of using the case involving abuse allegations dating back to up to 40 years to depopulate Pitcairn. British authorities have denied that and said they are pumping millions of dollars into the island to improve life there. Now, there might be some legitimacy to this claim. There's been several circumstances where the British have shipped members and people within the population of Pitcairn to other islands, and essentially led to the depopulation and the small number of people that exist there today. However, that doesn't excuse what happened in this particular circumstance. Just keep that in mind. There are only 12 adult men among the population, and those who are young and fit enough must crew a longboat to get essential supplies from passing freight and cruise ships. The island has no port, airstrip, or paved road. Now, the reason why is because it has a low-lying shelf underneath the island, and boats that arrive have to dock offshore and take small canoes back to the coast. Convictions for the 7 men, who are to be tried separately in 2 courtrooms, could make it virtually impossible to man the boats, islanders claim. Prosecutors called their highest profile defendant First Island Mayor Steve Christian. He faces 6 charges of rape and 4 of indecent assault on 4 women from 1964 to 75. I would keep in mind, I hope that you remember the name Steve Christian. It sounds familiar, and that's because he is a descendant of Fletcher Christian. Christian, 53, pleaded not guilty to the charges. Public prosecutor Simon Moore alleged that Christian committed these offenses when he was between 13 and 24 years old. In testimony given via a video link between the island and northern New Zealand city of Auckland, more than 31,100 miles away, the first prosecution witness described how, as a young girl of 11 or 12, she was taunted on the island for being a half-caste, and that she had been targeted and raped by Christian on 4 occasions. The cases appear certain to draw new attention to the sexual habits of the tiny community that ekes out an existence on the rocky volcanic island midway between New Zealand and Peru. Dee Burkett, a British journalist whose 1997 book Serpent in Paradise described her several months living on the island, has written, starved of real choices, Pitcairners develop relationships considered unacceptable elsewhere. Sisters share a husband. Teenage girls have affairs with older men. Women have children by more than one partner, often starting as young as 15. Later Wednesday, the cases of two other men were expected to open. Lynn Brown, the oldest defendant at 78, and his son Dave. Lynn Brown faces 2 charges of raping one woman, and his son faces 15 charges relating to 5 women. These charges date back to 1969. The cases are expected to last 6 weeks, and the defendants could be sentenced to lengthy prison terms if convicted. Investigations into the sex attacks were launched in 1999 when an islander told a visiting British policewoman she had been sexually abused. On Tuesday, a group of women residents on the island came to the defense of 7 accused men, claiming the cases had been blown out of proportion and that the victims may have been coerced into testifying. Speaking to reporters on the island, some of the women said underage sex was normal in the community. Island resident Carol Warren told New Zealand television on Wednesday that as far as she knew, there's never been a rape on the island. She added that she had sex at 12, but added, I went in fully knowing what I was doing. I wasn't forced. At early hearing, suspects' lawyers argued that the inhabitants of Pitcairn long ago severed their ties with Britain by burning their boat and carried them to their isolated island after the Bounty Mutiny. That argument was rejected in January 1790, 5 months after Captain William Bligh and 18 of his crew adrift in an open boat. The Bounty Mutineer landed on Pitcairn. Now, we've already read this already, but it is important to note that this is still an ongoing problem for this small, tiny island of a population of 50 in the South Pacific. And this is going to continue to be a problem as the population remains as low as it does. Okay, so that's about it for us today. So thanks for watching, and of course, as always, have a great day.